Okay, so welcome everybody to the first of the Graduate Outcome Statistical Release webinars. My name's Laura. I'm from the training team and I'll be sort of in the background today, making sure that everything is hopefully running smoothly. I'm just going to pop all of your hands down, so don't panic that something's happened. That's just me. As you'll see on here, just a little bit of housekeeping. You're all on mute except from us presenters. If you're having any sort of technical issues, so you can't hear something or you can't see something or something's just gone amiss, pop your hand up and I will send you a message or try to help you out, permitting that I'm not speaking myself. Otherwise, you've got the question pane there. Depending on whether you're using a computer or a tablet, it will be in a slightly different place. I think off the top of my head on the tablet, it's somewhere at the top and there's a little question mark icon, whereas on the laptop version, it should say questions in full. And any questions that you've got, please do send those in using the questions pane throughout the webinar. Just to sort of ease your mind, nobody else will see your questions other than us sort of members of HESA staff. So, ask anything that comes to mind. We will do our best to get through as many of the questions as we can during our dedicated Q&A session. But as I said, there are 100 of you due to join today. So it's unlikely that we'll be able to get through every single question, but we will be collating them at the end of the session. So we will go through as many as we can. It may well be that there are questions that some of my colleagues reply to you using that questions pane. Some of them we will save to the end and ask in that big Q&A session. As I said, this session is being recorded, and as with the other two webinars, we'll be recording those as well, and we will share one of the recordings after the whole series of webinars, just like we did last year. So just bear with us, just give us a few days to get those sorted, and if any of your colleagues were interested and wanted to watch, then one of those recordings will be available. This is a slightly longer session than we did last year because we wanted to do that big Q&A session. So once we've got the sort of main parts of the presentation out of the way, we'll be taking a brief comfort break before we embark upon the questions. This is the agenda for the session. We're going to be starting with a survey update, then looking through the statistical production work this year. Then Rebecca will be providing a tour of the bulletin. As I just said, we'll then be taking a brief comfort break, and then we will take our big Q&A session. So the speakers today, we've got Neha, who's the Head of Research and Insight, who will be speaking first, Jonathan, Director of Data and Innovation, and Rebecca, Head of Official Statistics. And as I said, my name's Laura and I'll be in the background, hopefully making sure that everything is running smoothly. So with that, I am going to pass across to Neha.
Thanks, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well, enjoying or coping with the heat. As Laura said, I'm going to start by providing a very quick overview of some of the significant changes we made to the Graduate Outcome Survey between years 1 and 2. Some of these would be obvious when you look at the outputs. Some are more subtle, but they have been published in various reports, and I'll come on to that towards the end of my slide. So the first major change that I want to talk about is what we did in response to the pandemic. So obviously, as you know, we carried on surveying graduates throughout the pandemic, and we believe we have done well if you look at the response rates. Back in March, April last year, we were obviously keeping a close eye on the changing government policies and especially the measures that were being put in place to support individuals who were in some form of employment. In light of those government policies and with a view to make survey completion really user-friendly, we added a reference to the furlough scheme to the first question itself, and therefore where somebody was in paid work with an employer, but they were at the time of filling the survey, at the time of the census week, were on furlough, they were allowed to select that option and they had that information. We also provided signposts to some of the leading mental health and wellbeing organizations around the world. And these signposts were available both on the online mode, but also on the CATI version, the telephony version of the survey. Our telephone interviewers received specific training from our contact center, IFF, to handle sensitive conversations. Moving on to the next major change, SOC, which is the Standard Occupational Classification. It's the framework that is owned, developed, and produced by the Office for National Statistics. And so in consultation with our steering group, we decided to produce, in order to produce comparable outputs, we decided to recode data from year 1 using SOC 2020. So as those of you who are familiar with the users, with the outputs that we produce from graduate outcomes, you would have seen that originally year 1 outputs were produced using SOC 2010. Early last year, ONS introduced a new iteration of the SOC framework, which was the SOC 2020. And like I said, in order to produce comparable outputs year on year, we decided to recode year 1 outputs using SOC 2020. Earlier this year, we published an ad hoc statistical release using the recoded data, which again, I hope you've had a chance to look at. Staying with the theme of SOC, the other new initiative we undertook was a new data quality assurance plan. It was a 3-stage plan, which comprised feedback from providers. So thanks to all of you and your colleagues who got involved in that exercise. The second stage was around doing more detailed internal checks on data quality using information on subject, provider, and also we now had the opportunity to do year-on-year comparisons and look at the distribution of SOC. The third and final element was an independent verification of the quality of the SOC data that was provided by our survey partner. We worked with the Office for National Statistics to take a subsample of the data and do some independent coding. Results from all these exercises have been published, and again, I'll refer to that towards the end in terms of where you can find more information. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of updates to the survey is the data quality improvements that we introduced. Most notably, the ones that we introduced to salary, postcode, and well-being questions. So for the salary question, we decided to remove the reference in the question to rounding. So as some of you, or most of you, might be familiar with the question wording, which referred to the respondent rounding the salary to the nearest 1,000. We felt that that might have encouraged some people to provide 1- and 2-digit salaries, thinking that the trailing zeros would be added automatically. But obviously that wasn't the case. So we removed that reference, and we are pleased to report that we have found a noticeable reduction in the volume of single and double-digit salaries. With postcode, partway through year 2, we introduced a postcode validator, which essentially checks the first part of the postcode, the employer's postcode that respondents are asked to enter. And again, I'm pleased to report that we have found an increase in the volume of usable data, because previously, in the absence of a validator, people could enter whatever they liked, or sometimes they were misheard by the interviewers. So having that validator in place means that whatever data we do collect is of good quality. Lastly, on well-being, we made some improvements by slightly changing the presentation of the questions. And this is based on work that we did using year 1 data, where we could see that there was some possible misinterpretation going on, especially due to the reversal of the scale in the last of the 4 questions for well-being. So we changed the presentation to highlight that the scale has been reversed. And we noticed that that was those misinterpretations were more prominent on the online mode. And again, I can report back that we have seen an improvement in the form of a reduction in what seems like a confusion. All these survey updates that I've talked about in the last couple of minutes have been reported. You will find more details on every single one of them in the survey methodology statement and the data quality report, which accompany the main statistical release. And if you have any questions on these or any other topics around survey data collection, then please do pop those questions into the chat box and we'll pick them up later. So now at this stage, I think I'll hand over to Jonathan to provide an overview of the range of analytical tasks we have carried out this year.
Thank you very much, Neha, and afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased to be introducing this second edition of the graduate outcomes data today. And as part of that, as Neha said, really, I wanted to just discuss a few elements that went into the preparation of this year's releases and some associated issues. Firstly, just to clarify. So this year's outputs are still designated as experimental statistics, as they were last year. So this indicates that the statistics are still in development, and we're seeking user feedback to ensure that they are meeting user needs. This proceeds for, as I say, the second year. It is customary for experimental statistics to be experimental for around 2 publication cycles. That is the convention, which is why we've applied that convention to the graduate outcomes data. My expectation is that we are likely to remove the experimental designation for next year's outputs. There are no hard and fast rules on this. The producer must make a decision as to when to remove that designation once they believe that the composition, the methodologies have reached a stable state and that they have evidence that the statistics are meeting user needs. So as I say, the expectation is that that would happen for next year's editions of the outputs. One of the things we have done as well this year is to create a new user guide format. Last year, some of you may remember, we issued progressively a number of blogs and clarifications and sets of supporting information in the run-up to the main release last year. This was due to the fact that we were receiving quite a lot of questions and interest from the sector to wanting to understand really how we were planning on presenting certain types of data, other aspects about how we were methodologically going to deal with and publish the graduate outcome statistics. This year, we have brought all of that together and taken a first step towards creating a user guide, a comprehensive user guide. So this really tries to bring all of that material together into one place to make it much more readily accessible for users. Next year, I think we'll take the next step on that, really trying to integrate the range of documents that currently we have within that overall framework of a user guide. But we would certainly welcome feedback from users as to whether you find that new format helpful. Next up is non-response bias and statistical weighting. So a bit of a technical issue. But some of you may recall last year we undertook our own assessment of non-response bias in the survey. Now, non-response bias occurs in any, or can occur, it's a risk in any survey with less than a 100% response rate, which essentially is pretty much every survey there is. It's something that needs to be tested for. We did that last year. It occurs when essentially the characteristics of those who responded differ systematically from those who did not respond. Or in other words, the sample of responses are not representative of the overall population. Now, we have the benefit with the graduate outcome survey of being able to link individual survey responses back to our census of all student information in the main HESA student record. So we're able to really test whether the characteristics of those who responded differ from the population. So that is quite a significant scope that we have. Last year, we undertook our own internal analysis of that, and some of you may recall we concluded that weighting did not improve the accuracy of data. And so our recommendation was that we did not weight the data last year. But the final recommendation from our work last year was that we should revisit that this year once we have 2 years worth of data, and also with potentially the benefit of trying to gain some independent perspectives on that. So this year, what we did was to procure some support and services from the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex to undertake an independent assessment of weighting, focusing on the 2018-19 data, but also applying models back to the 17-18 data to really test their efficacy and applicability. This work happens really over the last 3 months or so. We have published the final report, technical report from that work today alongside the outputs. The ISER tested a number of different weighting models, looking at a range of different variables to test whether those variables were associated with either non-response or 2 outcomes, which were the proportion of graduates going into employment and or study, and independently the proportion going into highly skilled employment or study. and they essentially generated a sequence of different models with different sets of auxiliary variables included. Their findings really mirrored our own findings quite closely, in that all of those models generated improvements in accuracy in only a very small minority of cases, and where those did occur, the level of improvement was very, very small. So they concluded that there was no substantial evidence of any non-response bias in the survey data, and that their recommendation again was that we should not weight the data. And we've accepted that recommendation. As I say, that full report is, for those who want the additional detail, is published on the HESA website. If we can go to the next slide. Great. So the other thing that we've looked at in depth, of course, and Niha's alluded to this, is the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. What we have here is a diagram which really shows how the different contact periods, you'll recall the survey is split into 4 cohort contact periods. And really this shows how it fits on the sequence of events associated with the pandemic last year. And what we've got here is the published case numbers with our cohort periods overlaid onto those. So as you can see, the contact period for cohort A and really the beginning of cohort B just about preceded the main restrictions that resulted from those case numbers increasing last year. Cohort D was at the beginning of the second wave, as you can see here, so quite heavily impacted potentially by the restrictions. Now, what we needed to do really was to ascertain the extent to which the pandemic may have had an impact on the ways in which graduates responded to the survey, or indeed whether they responded at all. Clearly, we needed to ascertain whether there were any impacts on quality of data, the utility of data for particular applications, and whether we needed to make any changes to how we constructed and published the data. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we undertook around a 6-week period of in-depth analysis of the data. And again, we have published a report today, an insight brief, which gives the full details of the outcomes of that research. But what I'm going to do really is try and just run through the headlines from that quite quickly. First of all, we found that the data quality remains high. There were no evidence of any effects which suggest quality has deteriorated. Now, the caveat I would place on that is that, of course, we only at this point have 2 years worth of data. So with only 2 years worth of time series, it is quite difficult to be sure about the level of change that one would expect on an annual basis. Nevertheless, I think we've been able to draw some quite sound conclusions from the comparison we've made between the 2 years of data. We've looked at response rate in particular to see whether response rates for particular subgroups have changed. Clearly, the pandemic has had different types of impact on different demographic groups, different extents of impact, the nature of the impacts has been different for different groups. So we wanted to really look at whether we were seeing any substantial changes in response rate patterns within the data. So we've looked at some various different types of subgroups, compared response rates between the 18-19 data and last year's 17-18 data, looking at dimensions such as age, sex, ethnicity, disability status, region of domicile, indices of multiple deprivation, and we didn't really see any effects which were clearly attributable to the pandemic within any of those. What we see really is the response rates remaining stable or increasing across the majority of those subgroups, and where we do see a reduction in response rates, it tends to be very, very small. So we don't see things which are indicative of non-response bias and indicative that we have problems with particular groups. We also looked at things like in industrial sector. One of our hypotheses we wanted to test for was whether, for example, we might see reductions in response rates for those working in healthcare professions, realizing how much pressure workers in those sectors have been under over the last 18 months. Now, clearly, unfortunately, if we don't have responses in the survey from particular groups, then we don't know what activities they were doing. So we couldn't directly test whether we were seeing a drop-off in response rates for those working in the healthcare sector. However, what we were able to do was to use subjects of study as a proxy, because we know that high proportions of graduates from healthcare courses go into healthcare professions. So on that basis, we looked at the response rates by subject. And again, we did not see any material changes in response rates, which we could clearly attribute to the pandemic. We then looked at some response rate patterns between the 4 cohorts. So as you saw in the previous diagram, we had differential levels of restrictions in place, both geographically and across time last year, that affected the cohorts differently. So one of the things we wanted to test for was whether we were seeing different types of characteristics in the 4 cohorts from what we saw last year in the 17-18 data. What we found from that was actually the patterns across the cohorts were quite similar to last year's data. Now, recognizing that the 4 cohorts are qualitatively and quantitatively different in nature, we saw similar patterns across the 4 cohorts this year to the patterns we noted last year. We have, going back to the response rates by subject, we have actually added that. One of the recommendations for the work was to add that for information to the data. So that's actually being added to the open data, which is due to be published on the 27th of this month. Some of the findings from that research also were, as you might expect. So we did note a higher proportion unemployed. That's gone up overall about 2 percentage points from the previous year. Unsurprisingly, given the economic impact that we know the pandemic has had and continues to have. And entirely unsurprisingly, we noted a huge drop-off in the numbers of graduates taking time out to travel, clearly because obviously they couldn't go to travel. One of the things we found which did surprise us a little more is actually that areas on graduate voice and subjective well-being seemed remarkably resilient, or at least thus far. So the graduate voice questions are really about, for example, whether the activity the graduate is doing is considered meaningful, fits in with their future plans, whether they feel they're utilizing what they learned during their studies in their activity. And that really held up very well compared with last year. So it was really clear that for those graduates who were in work at the time of the survey, the pandemic didn't really seem to change their feelings about the work they were doing. The other area we looked at was subjective well-being. So that really looks at how happy people are, their life satisfaction, the extent to which they feel their life is worthwhile, and their anxiety levels. And it did really surprise us that again seemed quite resilient. Now that may be because of the types of employment that graduates typically enter and the extent to which those possibly are a little more resilient to the impacts of the pandemic. But what we did see was perhaps a slight narrowing of the types of responses. So fewer graduates reporting very positive or very negative responses to those questions. More of a concentration in the kind of middle groups of those responses. But certainly in terms of overall, I think we've concluded the data remain of high quality, are fit for purpose, and largely have not needed huge changes in terms of how we are publishing those. But as we all know, the impact of the pandemic is going to be over a number of years. And we're going to be repeating this analysis annually for the next few years, really, as we start to see really the impacts, the economic impacts on graduates playing out. And we'll be looking to really track and understand how those patterns look. So I will finish there, I think, and next up, I think we have Rebecca, who's going to provide the live tour of the bulletin.
Rebecca, I am handing over the control to you now.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen so you can all view the same thing as me. Just bear with me a second whilst I check that's worked. Yep. Okay, fantastic. So thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to give you a tour of the Graduate Outcomes Statistical Bulletin, which we published just this morning at 9:30. Before I take you through the key findings in the data this year and the differences and similarities we see compared with the previous year's results, I first wanted to mention some key changes we've made to the presentation of the data this year, and this follows user feedback we've received since the 2020 publication. Excuse me. Firstly, we've made some changes to the way in which we treat self-reported salary data collected through the survey. So this is in addition to the methodology changes that Neha has mentioned to the survey itself. In relation to the publication, we've revisited our choice of salary outliers, and this was following further analysis of the 2017-18 and 2018-19 data sets, which we detail in our survey methodology, which is accessible via the user guide, which I'll show you in just a second. Our new upper threshold for outliers has been set to exclude the top 0.1% of reported salaries, which falls at approximately £245,000 in both years of data. Our logic for excluding outliers at the lower end of reported salaries remains based upon a minimum wage calculation. However, specifically for the 2018-19 data set, we have accounted for the fact that some graduates reporting salaries would have been furloughed, again, as Neha has mentioned. More details on the salary outlier thresholds we have applied can be viewed in our definitions supporting the release. In addition to our choice of salary outliers, we have also revised salary bands we're reporting on this year. We have retained the £3,000 bandwidth, but have this year added 4 additional bands at the top end. We did this essentially in recognition of the fact that our previous top band of £39,000 and above contained a reasonably sized proportion of graduates. And we wanted this year to provide additional detail to users of the data. Another change we've made to the statistics presented this year, again relevant to the data about graduates in work at the time of the survey, has been to base our standard occupational classification data on the SOC 2020 framework, as Neha has mentioned earlier. Just to reiterate, so in this publication, both the 2017-18 and 2018-19 data sets have been presented using SOC 2020, which allows for meaningful comparisons between the 2 years to be made. We have also this year expanded the amount of data we are presenting for graduates in work this year to include the details about UK regions in which graduates were working at the time of the survey. This is the first time we've published data on employment regions of graduates, and it follows an exercise we undertook to cleanse some free text information we've captured in this area of the survey to improve data quality. Again, further details about this data cleansing exercise can be read within our graduate outcomes quality reports. The final change I wanted to draw your attention to specifically this afternoon is around the coverage of the data presented this year, and in particular the target population from which response rates have been calculated. So within our releases last year, we reported data about a target population that excluded graduates who had been reported to us by their provider as being seriously ill or deceased. Where graduates were reported by any other means to fit these circumstances, for example, by a friend or a relative during the actual survey process, we had included these graduates in our target population previously. So this year, we really wanted to achieve consistency and therefore have included all graduates reported to be seriously ill or deceased within the target population for both years of data presented, and that's regardless of the source of the information. So all of these changes I've mentioned are covered, so within the notes section of the bulletin, they are mentioned there, so you can have a read and a recap of those changes. They're also detailed and a lot more information available within the user guide, which we published alongside the release. We link out to the user guide in the About This Release section, so towards the end, so you can access that through the bulletin itself. Just to give you a quick oversight of what that looks like, so that will take you to this page where you'll see a list of user guide contents. And in the main, this contains our survey methodology split out by the various sections. We then go on to some information around governance and data protection, and metadata and definitions. So we've updated our definitions, so things like the salary outliers that I've mentioned will be covered in our definitions, and then our quality report. We've also then got an archive and record of changes from information that's been updated from year one. So now, without further ado, we'll delve into the data published this morning and explore some of the key findings visible within the release. So first of all, we've presented some headline statistics in our summary section, which I think really iterate some of the points Jonathan was making earlier about the impact of the pandemic. So just a quick recap, we know that 2018-19 graduates would have graduated into a world pre-COVID. But at the point at which they were surveyed, the large majority would have been at various stages of COVID lockdowns. And we see that within figure one, we see some impact of that pandemic. So we see that there has been a decrease in the proportion of graduates in full-time employment in the 2018-19 data set compared with the previous year. We also see the opposite correlation in terms of graduates in unemployment. So again, an increase this year. And it actually works out as a 2% increase when we take into account the 3 unemployed categories at the bottom here. There's a slight decrease in graduates doing something else, including travel caring for someone or retired. And actually most of that drop, as Jonathan alluded to earlier, will be due to a drop in the numbers of graduates going travelling. Our other headline chart within our summary section of this release is to explore data on the salaries, the median salaries of graduates by gender and skill group of the work that they're undertaking. So this is restricted to, as the title alludes, to full-time first-degree graduates who are entering full-time paid employment in the UK. And as we can see from this chart, there is a gender pay gap among graduates, and that's most noticeable within graduates in high-skilled work. The About This Release section then details some useful information about how this release has been compiled. So we mention again COVID-19. We also link out, as I said, to the user guide and the various aspects of that user guide. Figure 3 then demonstrates the response rates we've achieved this year. And again, as Jonathan's mentioned, we see that we have achieved a higher response rate this year, both overall, but also for individual domiciles. And just to confirm, as we continue going through the release, everything presented within the data here is based on both complete and partially completed responses. What do we mean by partially completed responses? Well, again, we've got this drop-down box here. It's the same definition as we applied last year. And essentially, it's to do with graduates who begin the survey but drop out before they complete all of the mandatory questions. Sorry, not the mandatory questions, the core questions relevant to their circumstances. Moving on to the next tab of the release around graduate activities and characteristics. We first of all see a table, figure 4, which provides some more detailed information on the chart, figure 1, which we just viewed. So more detail on the activities of graduates by additional characteristics. So we've got domicile in the rows and a number of filters that you can apply to subset the data. We see here, so as well as presenting numbers, we present percentages and confidence intervals within the data. So just to give you a little bit of a recap and a reminder of what the confidence intervals are and how they can be used. When you see the numbers in the table, these will display the number of respondents undertaking each activity. If we scroll across to the table, you can see that non-respondents are counted separately. The percentages then show the proportion of respondents within each activity category. This is based on the sample of graduates who responded to the survey in each year. In fact, all percentages shown in this release are based upon data from the survey respondents, as you would expect. So it can be useful to understand whether the percentages accurately reflect the true proportion of graduates undertaking a particular activity within the entire target population. So the confidence intervals allow us to state with 95% certainty that the true percentage value lies within the specified range. So for example, we know with 95% confidence that the proportion of all graduates in full-time employment this year lay somewhere between 56 and 57%. As you start to drill down into the data more and apply more filters, you'll get to smaller and smaller populations, and you'll see that the confidence intervals start to widen. So again, if I just go back to the percentages and set all the filters back again, some of the key findings we see within this particular chart, again, we see unemployment around about 5%, excluding those due to start further study or due to start work in the latest data set. Unemployment is actually higher among non-UK domiciled graduates, so 6% here, compared with UK domiciled graduates at 5% this year. This was also true in 2017-18, but you see for both domiciles that has increased, unsurprisingly, this year. Unemployment is, as we know, up generally on the previous year, which really probably does reflect the environment during which the graduates were surveyed. In the corresponding commentary to this table, we've also included a link to labour market statistics published by the Office for National Statistics. And this helps to contextualise the data because it shows us that within the general UK population, there was also an increase in the rate of unemployment during the same time period. Moving on to figure 5, and we see some data, again, around the activities of graduates, this time split out by personal characteristics data. So this shows us, in terms of ethnicity data, so ethnicity being based around UK domiciled graduates for which we have data about ethnicity for. Graduates with a white ethnic background are more likely to be in full-time employment than those from any other ethnic background this year. That was also true last year, but I think the group, there's more of a difference between white graduates versus other graduates this year. White graduates were also least likely to be unemployed this year, which we can see from the percentages. Looking at all domiciles and comparing differences by the sex of the graduates, we can see here that unemployment rates are slightly higher among male graduates. But very interestingly, so is the proportion in full-time employment. And actually what we see is with females that we have a higher proportion entering part-time employment compared with males, in addition to graduates doing something else. Figure 6, we present some, again, activity information, this time by participation characteristics. We've included some new data in this table compared with our statistical bulletin published last year. So this table is already restricted to undergraduate, full-time graduates, but we have included a level of qualification breakdown here. So if you wished, you could just restrict this to first degree graduates, for example. We've also included, as well as the statistical marker, socioeconomic classification, parental education and polar data, we've also included the various indices of deprivation for the relevant 4 nations this year. So last year that came a week later in our open data, but we're releasing that early this year. So that's all there for you to have a peruse of. Figure 7 starts to drill down into some of the detailed data about graduates working for an employer in the UK. And we're looking here at the employment basis of those graduates. So this figure is restricted to graduates who report a most important activity of working for an employer. When we look at percentages, we can see that of those on a 0 hours contract, if we compare that to the previous year, we see an increase on graduates, the proportion of graduates on a 0 hours contract. And correspondingly, those on a permanent or open-ended contract, we see a decrease in that proportion this year. Figure 8, so again, some more detail on this time graduates running their own business or being self-employed or developing a portfolio. What we can tell here when we look at the percentages, interestingly, and this was true for both years, that quite a large proportion of those running their own business were actually domiciled from outside of the UK. And that's true when, for graduates, any graduate who reports work as one of their activities. We see that increases even further when we restrict to graduates whose most important activity was one of these 3 categories. Moving on to the next section, activities by previous study characteristics. So firstly, we see some information by graduate activity, again, by classification of first degree. And I think what's interesting about this chart is that we see when we look at those graduates who qualified with the first class honours, they have the highest rate of full-time employment and also the lowest rate of unemployment. And that gradually changes as you go through the classes, with third class graduates seeing the lowest proportion in full-time employment and the highest unemployment rate. With figure 10, we start exploring some subject data. So this would be the subject that the graduate undertook as part of their original degree and which they're answering the survey about. This shows us, again, if we look at percentages, this shows us that graduates from most subjects saw a rise in the proportion of unemployment this year. Interestingly, those who studied creative arts and design saw the largest decrease in percentage in full-time employment this year compared with the previous year, and also the largest increase in the rate of unemployment this year compared with 17-18 graduates. And again, if I just go back to this year's data set, looking at creative arts and design, we actually see quite interestingly that a large proportion of graduates who studied this subject go on into part-time employment. Figure 11, looking at the standard industrial classification of graduates who were in UK work at the time of the census week. And I think what's really interesting about this chart, if I just sort on this final column, we see that the 2 sectors with the largest proportion of graduates entering are both key worker sectors, so human health and social work activities and education, which I think is really interesting. So 21%, so 1 in 5 graduates in UK work are in the human health and social work activity industry within the data set this year. We've compared this in the text to, again, some more information published by the Office for National Statistics on workforce jobs by industry in the UK labour market as a whole. And that data set suggests in the UK labour market as a whole, 12 to 13% were in this specific industry. So we get a lot more graduates in terms of proportions, higher proportion of graduates in this industry compared to the UK as a whole. Figure 12, looking at the SOC data. So again, this will be based on SOC 2020. And what we see here is a 1 percentage point drop in the proportion of graduates entering highly skilled employment this year compared with the previous year. Quite a large table, so it would take a moment to load. So yeah, 76%, 75% in the 18-19 data set. We also see the two subjects in particular, so creative arts and design and physical sciences, had the greatest drop in proportion of highly skilled jobs at around a 3 percentage point decrease in the dataset this year compared with the previous year. Moving on to the next section, salaries of graduates. So as I mentioned, everything in terms of our salary outliers and salary bandings that we've changed will apply to this section. And what we see within the chart around figure 13, which displays the salary bands of graduates, when we look by sex, we see that higher proportions of females earn salaries below £27,000 compared with males. We can change the radio button to look at different personal characteristics. So if we look at something by ethnicity, if the chart will catch up with me, we'll give it a minute and just see if that does. What we essentially see when we look by ethnicity is that white graduates are also more likely to be earning below £27,000 compared with their peers from other UK domiciled ethnic backgrounds. Figure 14, so again, some more detailed information on the median salary of graduates. And what we see from this chart is that graduates from the 2018-19 academic year in high skilled jobs were actually earning either the same or a higher median salary compared with 2017-18 graduates. And that was true across all subjects. Some subjects saw a decrease in the median salary for those in medium and low skilled jobs this year compared with the 2017-18 data set. The next section, where were graduates employed, is brand new for this release. We didn't publish this data last year. So again, this is using up the cleaned location of employment data this year. And this first chart really demonstrates the flow of graduates from where they were domiciled prior to their higher education course through to the region in which their HE provider was that they attended, and then on to work. So what we can see here, for example, is in terms of the Northeast as a region of domicile, we see that there's almost 5,100 graduates who were domiciled initially in the Northeast, remained in the same region to attend university, and then were also decided to stay and work within the same region. This row, for example, again, 915 graduates who stayed in the same region for their provider as they did with their domicile, but then moved outside of the Northeast when they were in work. Figure 16 provides further detail on figure 15. So rather than just showing that they left that specific region, you can see the breakdown of the regions that graduates attended. So if I just set that to be the Northeast to be the same as the table above, we can see of those graduates who attended, who were domiciled, from the Northeast. If we just look at percentages, we can see that Northeast, we can see 72% remained in the same region as that in which they were domiciled. If you were interested in changing the region of provider, again, you can do that on the filter. So you may be interested in graduates who were domiciled from the Northeast, perhaps went up to Scotland, let's say, for their provider, just 3% did that. And then of those 3%, we can see that one of those 3% went back to the Northeast for their work, 1% stayed within Scotland. Moving on to the final section of the release, so graduate reflection on activities. So these will be the graduate voice questions. And just to note that responses to these questions do clearly vary depending on the activity that the graduate was doing. We allow for a breakdown by activity in all charts that we publish around the graduate reflection questions. And as Jonathan's mentioned earlier this afternoon, we do see very little differences in the responses of graduates this year compared with last year. The chart doesn't change much. So this year, as with last year, those in full-time employment were most likely to strongly agree, sorry, not full-time employment, full-time further study, were most likely to strongly agree or agree to all 3 of the graduate reflection questions. And interestingly, those in voluntary or unpaid work were more likely to strongly agree or agree to the questions than graduates who are in part-time employment. So all in all, lots of interesting findings in the data this year. For those of you who wish to explore the data further, you have the option of downloading the source data behind each figure. This will give you a CSV file detailing each data point for every single combination of filters you have the ability to apply within the figure. The download chart data or download table data option will produce a CSV file of the data you're currently viewing with any specific filters applied. So do please have a look at that information and also the user guide for any supporting information you may need too. And just a final note to finish on before I hand you back over to Laura. We really love to hear from the users of our data. And I'd just like to ask you all a big favour, if you could, just to spare a few moments to provide us with feedback on this release. The quickest way in which you can do this is to answer the question we provide within the bulletin. Does this data release meet your needs? Yes or no? It's completely anonymous. We don't see who submitted those forms. And that just really helps us to know whether we are meeting user needs or not. If you wish to, if you do have comments or questions or wish to provide any more detailed feedback, I would suggest using the contact details provided higher up in the release. And that's everything from me for now. So I'll hand you back over to Laura.
Brilliant, thank you. So in which case, we're now going to have a comfort break. We want to come back at a nice round number so everybody knows which time we're coming back. So I make it a couple of minutes too. So if we come back at 5 past, then we will get on with our Q&A session. So if your weather is like it is up here today, go grab a cold drink, cool down, and then we'll see you all at 5 past. Okay, I make it 5 past. Hopefully we'll manage to grab a quick cold drink. Would you mind just popping your hands up once again, please, to indicate that you're back with us? And then just keep them up for a moment. I'll now just check that we've got most people back, and then we will embark upon our Q&A session. So while we're answering questions, please do keep sending those in. We will answer as many as we can, and any that perhaps aren't appropriate for this sort of topic of the webinar, or to be answered, or that we need more information on, we will take away with us. It looks like we've got about half of everybody back. I'll just give everybody another minute because all our clocks might be slightly different. So if you can just keep your hand up to indicate that you're back, and then we'll pop those all down in one moment. Okay, once again, for anybody who's just come back, if you could pop your hand up using the hand raising icon and just keep it up for a moment so I can check who we've got back with us. Right, I think we will get going given the time. So for our first question, the first question I am going to ask is going to Rebecca. Will you be releasing detailed specifications for the tables released today? I'm looking at table 12 in my own data, but came across several questions about how it was specified.
Thanks, Laura. So we will be looking to release a specification for the figures presented within the bulletin. It won't be today, but we hope to do that within the fairly near future. What I would say is that a large number of the figures are very similar, so you have the same very similar restrictions and breakdowns as our statistical bulletin last year. We published a tables and charts specification for the 2017-18 data set, and that is still accessible. And that's the best way to access that is through the user guide. At the bottom, where we have an archive and record of changes to the user guide, we've still got our tables and charts specification for 17-18. So I'd look at that in the meantime. But yes, we do wish to publish an updated tables and charts specification in due course for this release.
Great, thank you. And then another question for you, Rebecca. We measure most of our results for first degree full-time home respondents. This is not possible on all data tables here. Will this be possible on further data releases?
Okay, thank you. So a large number of our tables and charts either restrict or provide a filter by level of qualification, mode of qualification, and domicile, which I think are the 3 filters required there. So have a read of the chart titles, just because, as I mentioned, some of them will already restrict to first degree graduates or undergraduates. And in probably the majority of tables, we will provide filters to allow you to break that down. I'm aware we don't do that in every case. And it's largely to do with what we're presenting, what we think will be most useful to users. So I would say that it's probably available for most charts, but yes, not all.
Great, thank you. And then I've got a question for Jonathan. Is there any guidance on creating statistics from our own institutional results that are comparable with these sector statistics?
Okay, thanks. So I think essentially the technical specification that Rebecca was just talking about, that would be one of the documents you would need to do that. That will give you the technical definitions to allow you to replicate essentially equivalent metrics or measures or data to the published data using your own institutional data, assuming you're using the your institutional copy of the graduate outcomes data and linked to your own copy of your student records data.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, I've got another question for you. Please, can you clarify exactly what data is being released next Tuesday?
Okay, so the release next Tuesday will be the wider open data release. Again, within the technical specification that we'll be releasing, that will contain the full breakdowns of what will be included in every single table within that release. Largely, it will be provider level breakdowns as we published last year, so those will be updated for the 2018-19 results. There will be one or two new additions to the release this year as well. So Jonathan's already mentioned we'll be including a table on response rates by subject. So mostly the same as what we published for 17-18, but with a bit of updates.
Great, thank you. And then Jonathan, another question for you. What is the situation regarding E1A performance indicator data that compares the UK full-time first degree percentage rate across institutions? Will there be an equivalent for graduate outcomes?
Okay, thanks, Laura. So the answer in short is no. I published a blog back on the 19th of May, which is available on the HESA website, which explains a piece of work we've been doing over a number of months, really, to reevaluate the role and purpose of the UK performance indicators. And we've been engaging with a number of sector bodies and associations to do that. We have concluded as part of that work that the UKPIs need fundamental reform. And there are a number of reasons. I won't spend too long talking right now about it. It's all detailed in the blog. There are a number of reasons for that, not least the fact that essentially the regulatory landscape has changed radically over the last few years, particularly in England. And we're now in a situation where there is a distinct lack of coherence between the UKPIs and published regulatory metrics, especially in England. And we are, as designated data body in England, we are required to resolve that lack of coherence. And they are a set of indicators as well and measures that have existed over many years and have remained fairly static over many, many years. And I think there are questions over fitness for purpose now. So what we're doing, really, what we've announced is that we will no longer be producing performance measures for providers, because that's not HESA's role to do that in a regulatory environment that we currently have. But what we are going to be doing is initiating a process of migrating content from the UKPIs into our core outputs. But one thing that will go from that will be the statistical approach to benchmarking. And as part of that suite of decisions, we have taken the decision not to attempt to replicate the former table E1 employment indicator using graduate outcomes. So there will be no new UKPI drawing on graduate outcomes data. What we will instead do is look to really enhance and build our suite of information, including measures within our core outputs, but those won't be, as I say, they won't include the benchmarking dimension.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, another question for you. Someone has asked, do we know whether highly skilled employment is down for full and part-time?
Okay, so from this question, I'm going to interpret. So figure 12 is where we look at the standard occupational classification of graduates who are in work in the UK. So looking at the proportion of graduates in work in the UK by the different skilled jobs in which they undertake. We do provide a filter on that one for mode of form of study. I've just quickly applied that myself, and looking at the data for full-time employment, we see a decrease. So from 74% of graduates in the 17-18 academic year down to 73% in 18-19 being within high skilled jobs. We see the opposite actually for part-time graduates of part-time courses. So for the 2017-18 data set, we see that 85% of part-time graduates were in highly skilled work, and that's up to 86% in the 2018-19 data set.
Fab, thank you. Jonathan, another one for you. Someone has asked, might we have expected a higher number or percentage in further study given the challenges of the employment market for the 18-19 graduates, whereas I think it looks remarkably stable or similar to 17-18?
Yes, that's a really good point. And in past major economic recessions, we have seen an increase in graduates going on to further study. I think the answer is, at the moment, it's probably too early to see that, whether that is in fact going to manifest itself in the current environment. Going back to what we said earlier, these are not the graduates who graduated into the pandemic. These are the people where the census point 50 months after graduation aligned with various stages of the pandemic. So, and I think given the lead times involved in securing further study opportunities, it's something we're going to need to be monitoring closely, I think, over the coming years. But I think right now is too early really to see that impact, if indeed that impact is going to exhibit itself.
Thank you. Rebecca, I've got another question for you. I noticed that there is no option to select undergraduate or postgraduate level for activity, which is figure 1, and response rates for figure 3. Why is this not available to better understand outcomes?
Right, good question. So figure 1 is part of the summary section, and as standard with all of our statistical bulletins, we try and avoid putting filters onto our summary tables, because what we're really trying to do is give users a quick snapshot of what the data is showing this year. Figure 4 of this release actually is a much more detailed version of figure 1. So you can get that information from figure 4, where we provide activity detail with many, many filters, including level of qualification. On figure 3, so the response rates chart, excuse me, I think we have a filter by mode. We don't have a filter by level, but we do, within our open data, our wider open data, we provide response rates with a level of study, a level of qualification breakdown.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, another one for you. Referencing figure 8, there seems to be an increase in all undergraduates reporting that they are developing a portfolio, in particular UK totals where work is an activity. Is this an indication that more respondents were seeking to develop their professional or creative portfolios during the pandemic?
Okay, so I think my response to that would be possibly, but it's difficult to say with only 2 years time series of data. So going back to what I said earlier, with only 2 years, we don't necessarily have a very strong idea of what sort of variation we would expect from year to year in a kind of stable pattern. So it looks as though that might be the case, but I think we would need further years of data and a longer time series to identify whether any changes are due to natural fluctuation from year to year, or whether there's an emerging trend on that. So I think, unfortunately, I can't give a categorical answer to that. I think it's something we would need to look at over a longer time series, really, to be sure whether that is a trend.
Great. And Rebecca, when will the detailed provider data be published to enable detailed absolute and relative provider comparisons?
So the detailed provider data will be coming in our wider open data set, which we're expecting to publish next week. So that should be next Tuesday.
Yeah, and we'll be talking through next steps at the end of this webinar. Jonathan, another question for you. Why do some graphs split out first degree from other undergraduate, but others only show undergraduate or postgraduate?
Okay, so this really goes back to what Rebecca was saying earlier. What we've tried to do with this output, given the fact that we have a huge number of potential permutations and combinations of variables we could include in a whole sequence of tables and charts, is we've tried to make what we think are reasonable decisions about what data, what comparisons, what cross tabulations should be available in each of these figures. This is part of the experimental status of these statistics. So we are, in doing that, we are seeking feedback from users as to what users would find useful. So I think there's actually quite a number of questions similar to this that have been raised in the chat. We will collate all of the feedback on this. I mean, we're looking to try and understand what users need, all of the comments that we've had in this chat along these lines about particular figures and whether it would be useful to include other filters or other fields, really helpful feedback, and just the kind of feedback that Rebecca was talking about earlier that we're really seeking. So we will collate all of this and look to identify where there are frequent requests for changes and build those into future editions of the statistics.
And then I've got another question for you, Jonathan. Do you have any idea what indicator will be used for the progression data using graduate outcomes for the access and participation data that is released by the OFS usually in springtime? For example, highly skilled employment or further study. This year's release didn't contain graduate outcomes data and only contained, oh, sorry, it just moved, and only contained the Delhi. Do you have any idea when it might appear in the APP data?
So I think, unfortunately, without wanting to pass the buck, that probably is a question more for OFS. I think they would be better placed to respond to that categorically.
Great, thank you. Bear with me, everybody, while I just look through our questions. So another one for Jonathan. In the continued absence of a much missed and needed national performance indicator, what is the single key stat here that you would point to help everyone quickly understand graduate outcomes?
That's a really interesting point. I think my response would be that I can't point to any single statistic which provides a single summary of graduate outcomes which would be reliable and comprehensive. I think if people want to understand the characteristics of the survey responses we're receiving, then unfortunately it requires a bit of legwork to look at the range of statistics available and where there are particular areas of interest, that those are informed using the range of data and statistics that we currently publish. We're not making any assertions about being able to boil all of the information down into a single metric. That's not our plan to do that, and we don't think that's really realistic. So I think, unfortunately, it is one of those areas of situations where one does need to look at a range of information to gain a balanced and comprehensive picture of what the survey is telling us.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, bear with me a moment. I'm just taking a look through. Rebecca and Jonathan, there are a couple of questions there. Are you happy for those ones to go through now? Would you deem those ones appropriate now, or better to take away with us?
Just having a look.
Keep your questions coming in, everybody. We've probably got time for a few more. We will stop our questions just before past, because I'll just take you through a couple of resources. If we just give everybody a moment to pop some more questions in. If you haven't had yours answered, it may well be that we are taking your question away. Got a few more coming in. We'll just give everybody a moment more. Okie doke. So Jonathan, I've got another one for you. How much overlap or comparison can be made between the graduate outcome statistics and the OFS's publication, projected completion and employment from entrant data, proceed, updated methodology and results?
Okay, so I'm not very familiar with the latest detail on that. As I alluded to earlier, one of the things we're trying to do is to improve coherence between the measures and statistics that we publish with those published by the Office for Students. So we will be working with them to try and ensure that that coherence is in place. They are, they have the power to decide on their own methodology and their own approach and use of data. But we will work with them to try and ensure, as far as possible, that any definitions, any methodologies are coherent and based on the same core data. But I think that's probably as far as I can really go today without having had that discussion with OFS and without that deep understanding of where those comparabilities or indeed differences exist.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, another one for you. This is a good question. Apart from the 18 figures, can you confirm what other content we should read? So, for example, user guide, briefing notes, etc.
Sure. So I would say it's well worth having a look at the user guide. So I had that up on screen earlier during my demonstration. The contents page gives you a full list of everything included in the user guide. You may find some bits more relevant than others depending on your uses of the data, but it's well worth having a look at that contents page because that will contain links off to all of the supporting information we've put out with the bulletin itself. The other thing I would recommend having a read of, as well as the bulletin itself, is the insight briefing, which explores the impact of the pandemic and goes into more details around those summaries that Jonathan highlighted at the beginning of his talk. So again, that will be linked out to from the bulletin itself as well.
Great, thank you. And as I said a moment ago, we'll be taking everybody through a few resources before we finish the session today. Jonathan, another question for you. Now that we have data from 2 years, are you aware of any association between response rates and positive outcomes for providers? For example, higher response rate, higher percentage of graduates in highly skilled employment.
Okay, so what we're essentially talking about here is a form of non-response bias. So this goes back to what I was saying in my section about the analysis work that we have procured this year and undertaken ourselves last year, looking at identifying associated variables with non-response and to identify whether there is non-response bias. So we have tested, as part of that analysis, we have tested, and also our contractor ISER at the University of Essex have tested the relationship between provider level data and non-response and subjects within providers and non-response and the association to proportions in employment and proportions in highly skilled employment. And that's fed into the construction of the various weighting models. So the conclusion from that was that we did not find that clear association that we have essentially a non-response bias existing within providers with lower response rates. And weighting was not able to correct that bias. It was not indicative of bias. So I think what we're saying, what we're deducing from that is that we're not seeing a systematic effect along the lines that this questioner has put forward.
Great, thank you. I think we will pause it there because I'm aware that time is running out. So if I just make sure you can see the next slide on my screen. We've already mentioned some of these resources already, but you can see a link on screen here to our data and analysis page. So here you will find the statistical bulletin that we've seen today and the subsequent open data. The graduate outcomes user guide that we've made reference to, which includes those things that we have seen on screen. Some frequently asked questions as well about the statistical releases. And it's the sort of questions that we get in today that can also help inform that research, and also, as Rebecca pointed out earlier, a chance to provide feedback. And we would recommend, if you've got time, providing that feedback. As Rebecca said, it is anonymous and it really helps us to produce outputs that are helpful to you. So in terms of what's next, we're looking forward to the further release of more detailed graduate outcomes open data, and we are expecting this to be published on the 27th, which, as Rebecca said, is next Tuesday, and this will include those breakdowns that we've been making reference to by provider. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. I've just seen a question come in asking if the recording will be circulated. As I mentioned at the beginning, what we're going to do is we are recording each of the 3 webinars. We're pulling out the questions that have been asked, and particularly any questions that we haven't answered live during the session, and we will be disseminating one of the recordings. So if anybody was sort of around last year for this, we popped a recording up on the website, and we'll be doing the same again, and we'll look to put other materials up there as well. Likewise, once this webinar is over, I will send all those who attended a copy of our slides as well. And in addition to that, there will be a link in there to our training feedback survey. So again, if you would have a moment to provide feedback, it's really helpful for us. But otherwise, if you've got any other questions, feel free to pop them in. We will do our best to take away as many as we can. But otherwise, have a lovely rest of your day.